Many of us are persuaded that shortfalls of demand are a key cause of economic recessions. We see production of automobiles and new homes fall, not because it's more difficult to make them, but because nobody wants to buy them. And the conventional understanding of why shocks to demand have these real effects is based on nominal rigidities. Wages and prices don't adjust quickly enough in response to the change in demand, and that's why we see real effects. My paper is part of another tradition. The model I'll be presenting, wages and prices are perfectly flexible. Everything's market clearing, and yet demand shocks can be a main cause of economic downturns. There is a literature on that theme. The two papers most closely related to what I'm going to be talking about are some work by Dan Murphy and also along with Auerbach and Grodnichenko, who emphasize capacity constraints and near zero marginal production costs. Those are also the key features of the model I'm going to be talking about. A main difference between my paper and theirs is they take capacity to be exogenous, and I'm going to derive capacity endogenously in a general equilibrium growth model. So the key technological friction that I'm suggesting we should be thinking about in place of the Keynesian nominal friction is the fact that some goods can only be produced using specialized resources that are committed in advance. I think that's the nature of any modern economy. Now, a key aspect of those specialized resources, of course, is specialized capital. Your factory produces a particular kind of car and it's really good at that, but you're committed in advance to that particular kind of production. Now, actually, in the model I'll be presenting, labor is the only factor of production. And so by specialization, I mean training. Production of some goods requires training and assembling a group of workers that are dedicated to producing that particular good. And a key variable focusing on will be creating a new good. So creating a new good is a little bit risky. You've got to spend some time, make an investment, get the skills to produce that good. May work, may not. But if you're successful, you've got a monopoly. You're the only person that can produce that. You're the only group of people that can produce that good. And you're going to behave like a monopolist, maximize profits subject to the capacity. And so when you have capacity constraints, if demand for your particular good falls, profit maximization calls for lowering both quantity and the relative price. So as I say, prices are perfectly flexible. Everybody's always charging the profit maximizing price, but prices don't fall any more than that because it would mean lower profits. Output and prices fall in response to lower demand. And there's no market force to bid costs down because if you already got excess capacity, marginal production cost is zero. Now, one of the main reasons people kind of think maybe there's going to be a dead end street is, of course, I'm talking about a shock to relative demand. I'm saying people want less of good J. And there's a notion, well, that means they're wanting to buy something more of something else, and don't those wash out? Not necessarily, because other goods may be capacity constrained. And if you have a shift in demand from a good that's now in excess capacity to a good that does not have excess capacity, what you see is an increase in the price in the capacity constrained good, no change in quantity. And so the vision I'm proposing is that a modern economy is specialized, configured to very efficiently produce a specific set of things. And if everyone wants to buy those set of things, then we can do a great job of delivering them. But if there's a change in the configuration of demand, output has to fall because you're not optimized resources to produce this new mix that people want, and you can't costlessly shift your specialized resources. And so it's a different notion of potential output from the usual one. It's going to operate at an aggregate level, but the source of it is very much micro. So the key state variable in my model in terms of tracking what goes on in the aggregate economy is a variable called N1, which is the fraction of the population that do not have a specialization. They do not have a high skill, high paying job. Now, this number, N1, is going to be determined endogenously. That's where all the firepower in the paper is organized and calculate exactly what that's going to be. It's an outcome of people evaluating the costs and benefits of becoming specialized, but it's predetermined at date T because you have to go through a period of training and experimentation to see if you can acquire that skill next period. And furthermore, if there's a sufficiently large drop in demand for a particular good, that may induce the team to stop producing and join the pool of unskilled. So it was a good game while we had it, but right now and for a fair time to come, people just don't want this product. The team may choose to disband and they all join the pool of unskilled. So in the steady state growth path that I'm going to be describing, all the time there are some goods being discontinued because people don't want them so much anymore, and new goods being created. And that's the nature of the equilibrium growth path. But N1 is also a factor in the demand for all goods because the unskilled have lower income. So if you have an increase in the fraction of unskilled, there's lower demand for every good. And there's a Keynesian type of multiplier. A decrease in demand for one good can lead to an overall drop in demand for all goods. It's different from the Keynesian multiplier in that this is very much a micro production story. What's going on is that with the change in demand, we're not configured to produce as efficiently, so people aren't buying as much, and that's contributing to more inefficiency. So it's kind of like the Keynesian story that people are familiar with, but it has nothing to do with nominal rigidities. It all operates through these technological frictions. So let me give you an example of what I'm going to do with this. I mean, usually you kind of put this at the end of the talk when everybody's tired and you rush through it. I'm going to put it at the beginning when nobody knows exactly what I'm talking about, but we'll see if it works. Just to give you all a flavor for the kind of thing I'm trying to do with this. So I'm going to start off the economy at date T naught with all the variables on the steady state growth path. And I'll characterize that steady state growth path when I get into the details, with one exception, which is that demand is 10% lower than it would be on the steady state growth path for 15% of the goods. And I'm going to calibrate this. I'll show you the calibration to have numbers that I think are sort of realistic to think about the economy. So in the absence of general equilibrium effects, which are built into the model, but basically what happens is those goods that have lower demand are going to lower production by 10% and lower the price by 10%. That's an endogenous choice they make along the steady state growth path. The elasticity of demand turns out to be 1, so it's 10% drop in price and 10% drop in quantity. If there's a 10% drop in quantity for 15% of the goods, this is roughly a 1.5% shock to GDP. And I'm going to assume for this example, the low demand is going to persist for 5 periods. Everybody knows that at time T naught. They know we're going to have low demand for 5 periods, and then we're going to return to steady state. And in this example, I'm going to assume the low demand also affects any new goods they could try to create over the next 5 periods. And so here's what that looks like. Here's the dynamic behavior of that economy from time T naught forward, looking at a couple of variables. The top is the fraction of workers who are unskilled, this number N1 that I was talking about, the deviation from steady state. So 0.01, we got 1% more unskilled people than usual. 0.02, we got 2% more unskilled people than usual. The horizontal axis is time. This model is calibrated for quarters, so 4 quarters is about a year. And the bottom panel is real GDP. So in the top panel, at time t0, there's no change in the fraction of workers without skills because, as I say, that's predetermined. And it turns out for this example, for these particular numbers, there's no change in real GDP at time 0. And what happens is there's lower production of these impacted goods. They cut production by 10%, all of them. There isn't any way to costlessly move the resources, but there are people without skills who are producing some other stuff that's part of GDP. And those other people basically look ahead and see that there's going to be lower opportunities, really, lower returns for specialization in the future because of the lower demand for these goods. So they actually choose not to be unemployed and choose instead of trying to develop skills, they just stay where they are, unskilled. And so they produce more of the good, more of the unskilled, undifferentiated good. And actually for this numerical example, it turns out that increase in production of the unskilled goods at date t0 exactly offsets or almost exactly offsets the reduction in production of the specialized goods. That's the way some people's intuition would be for how a relative demand shift works. It happens in this example just because of the nature of the numbers and the general equilibrium. But what happens over time, because at date t0, fewer of those unskilled people were investing in trying to create new goods or investing in trying to acquire skills, over time, the fraction of the population that's unskilled rises. It rises because of population growth. There's new inflow of people unskilled. And it rises because of what I assume is always going on in the background, that some goods are no longer wanted and are being discontinued. So this state variable N1 is rising. And as it rises over time, as I said, that's a factor lowering real GDP through this Keynesian multiplier. We're just not producing as much of the high valued stuff. And that continues through the first 4 periods. After beginning period 5, the demand shock is all gone. Everybody's back to steady state parameters, but we don't get back to the steady state level in period 5. And the reason is because we have this surplus really of unskilled. They are gradually going to go back into the process of trying to develop a skill. That's gradually going to bring real GDP back up. And so that's the nature of what the dynamic response looks like for that example. So here's what I see as the contributions of the paper. One thing is it gives a prediction of asymmetry in that a decrease in demand is a different thing from an increase in demand. And some of you old enough to remember, this used to be a lot of discussion of this. People used to think of this in terms of price rigidities having some kind of asymmetry. Here, it results entirely from technology. It results entirely from the fact that lower demand can bring you below capacity, causing you to reduce output. Higher demand does not bring you above capacity. Second contribution, the model can deliver a hump-shaped response to a demand shock. And this also is something we see in the data that's a little puzzling. We see, for example, monetary contraction, and it's not until months later that we seem to see a response of the real economy. And there are people who talked about that and the various models to explain it. Here it arises entirely from that multiplier effect through N1. And so that's one of the reasons I showed you that particular example. It doesn't have to be hump-shaped. Depends on the example and how long it lasts and various things, but can get that hump-shaped response. Third contribution. One of the striking things you see in the data is that, for the last 100 years, there's been tremendous growth of real GDP, but the unemployment rate is roughly constant. And that's actually a puzzle. Martellini and Menzio have a paper pointing out why that's a problem for a lot of conventional models of unemployment. They have an explanation for how it would arise. It arises in my model endogenously. The steady state growth path is growing population, growing productivity, growing real output, and yet the unemployment rate is steady because the costs and benefits of being unemployed are all growing at the same rate as the economy. Fourth contribution, it's a unified model of growth and fluctuations. I'm not going to give you one model and say this is short run and another model and say that's the long run. Here it's one single model. Prices are always perfectly flexible, short run or long run. In this model, the long run is going to be determined solely by productivity and population growth. That's the nature of the model's prediction. Short run, all kinds of things can contribute to fluctuations. I've been emphasizing demand. Other things, productivity shocks and so on, would also contribute to short run deviations. Fifth, it's a new model of income inequality. In my model, there is differences in income across people along the steady state growth path. And those arise from successful gambles to create new goods. You become one of the higher income people by taking a risk. And if that pays off, you join the ranks of higher income people. And everybody is making that choice endogenously, ex ante. They're doing exactly what's in their best interest. Sixth contribution, it's a new way of thinking about monopoly power. I'll give a description of monopoly power that's sustained in a growing economy, even though new goods are being introduced all the time and old goods are being discontinued all the time. So we have kind of a standard workhorse model, the Dixit-Stiglitz model for thinking about that. This model is totally different from that. It's another horse you can work on for these issues if you want to. Finally, there's lots of heterogeneity built into the model. I'm not going to make any assumptions about a representative firm or representative consumer. Everybody's different. But the nature of the equilibrium allows us to characterize what goes on, both at every individual level and in the aggregate, using really a small number of equations. So it turns out to be tractable. I can calculate things like I showed you in that simulation. So that's what I see as the contributions. What's not to like? Well, one issue is that in that example I just showed you, at T naught, everybody knew what was going to come. They know demand is low at T naught. They know at T naught, demand is going to be low at T naught plus 1. They're all making the optimal decision at T naught given what they think is going to come. So in that sense, it's a rational expectations kind of model. But I'm not going to explain how they got to that position at T naught. Just the example was some reason at T naught we're not at the steady state growth values. Here's the path that the economy would take to return to steady state. That's what I'm doing to look at impulse response functions. Sometimes people call these MIT shocks. If you don't like MIT shocks, you're not going to like this because that's what I do. Personally, I'm okay with that. You can think of this as if you build a slightly more general model, had these people anticipated T naught minus 1, what was going to come. If there's a relatively low probability of this particular outcome that ends up happening in T naught that I looked at, I think it's going to look the same. But anyway, that's one limitation. If you're willing to forgive me for that, maybe you're not going to forgive me for this. Goods are non-storable. There's no capital in my model. There's no financial markets, and there are no intermediate goods. In other words, there's none of the stuff that macro is all about. The only dynamic programming problems in the model are this decision of whether you want to try to develop a skill, whether you want to try to create a new good, and whether it's time to give up the shop on your existing good or whether you should keep on in production. That's the only dynamic programming aspect here. Now, what excuse do I give for that? Well, one, it was kind of hard for me just to do this much. And the paper's kind of longer than I can present even in the generous 2 hours that Doug gave me for this talk, longer than I can cram into a standard journal kind of length. Also, maybe I could argue from the point of view of sociology of science. I think there may be a benefit to leaving stuff for other people to do. And I've left all kinds of stuff for other people to do if you're at all interested in this. I guess my main answer is that by focusing on just a single source of specialization and technological friction, it can illuminate what I see as the main theme, which is the way that specialization and demand interact to determine short-run GDP. Okay, so let me just stop there for a moment. That's the general idea of the paper, and I'll go into details in a moment, but I'm guessing that at this point I may have said something that provokes questions or comments or whatever. So let me just open it up to any remarks people may have.
So while people are thinking, I can see Jesper thinking. Hi, Jesper. But while people are thinking, the thing that kind of popped into my mind is what is a demand shock, like technically in your model? And I presume what's going on here is demand is equal to supply, right? There's no money, there's no financial.
Great question. And so that's a drawback to trying to present this the way I did. So basically consumers are going to have preferences for the goods, and it's going to be a shock to preferences. I'm going to change a parameter in the preferences people have for good J relative to what the value is along the steady-state growth path. So as I said, it's all a micro.
Yeah.
It's all a micro thing.
Okay, Pablo.
Thanks. So very interesting. I cannot but think that this model is uniquely suited to understand the pandemic, the economic effect of the pandemic, because of one reason, but I have two things that I think that do not fit really well there. The thing that actually fits it very well is that the pandemic was a very sectoral change in demand, because some things became very dangerous to consume. Everything that involved social interaction became very dangerous. So it's a very sectoral type of shock in demand. However, there are two things that I believe do not fit exactly with what you are including here. One is this idea that is just a shift parameter in demand, because it's also the case on the supply side. It's very dangerous to supply social interaction. So it's like a productivity shock at the same time. And second, at least in Latin America, the main one of the stylized facts of this is that the unskilled labor market that usually is a buffer during recessions, today with the pandemic, it collapsed completely, because the unskilled, let's say, production is heavily reliant on social interaction. So the collapse in demand also involved a lower demand and very dangerous supply of the unskilled activity. So you have this bump in unskilled sort of labor, which in Latin America was totally the opposite, because that was the sector that was affected. So, but I think it's very easy to tweak it, right?
Yeah, no, great comments. First, I didn't mention it, but the model also has productivity shocks, and if we have time at the end, I'll show some examples of that. I sort of emphasize the demand because, as I say, I think in a typical recession, that's what's going on. But I agree totally. The pandemic is a wonderful example. And one thing that struck me is I would go to the grocery store and some of the shelves were empty at the same time that I was reading about farmers who couldn't sell their product, or the wholesalers who couldn't move their product. And that to me is exactly what I'm talking about. Now I'm thinking of goods at a very narrow level. So I actually think of a grocery store, for example, as a collection of a large number of enterprises, some of which may be in excess capacity, some of which are in excess demand at the same time. Yeah, I was originally intending to have an empirical part of the paper and get into that exactly. Now, the skilled and unskilled, that's a great observation. I want to think about that some more. As I say, it's really kind of a shorthand for specialization of capital in my mind. And I build a model without capital because it's simpler. In the model without capital, it's all about specialization of labor. So I want to, if I can get away with it, suggest we can think of specialization of labor and what goes on with that as telling us about specialization of other factors, which I think are critical, specialization in the supply chain and so on. But anyway, great point.
Armin?
Yes, thank you very much. I have 4 questions. I hope I'll remember, the last one when I start asking the first one.
I'll write them down to help me.
So the first question is, how would you think of news shock in this setting?
I'm sorry, news shock?
News shock. And maybe it's related to the MIT shock that you mentioned, but it's just interesting. How would you think about that one? Second one, given that so in your case, demand is very intimately connected with the productivity in some sense. Do you, and you said that in the long run, basically everything is determined by the technology and population growth. So can you help us thinking about, if it allows to think about hysteresis effects? Because if you have let's say a big demand shock, and it can fundamentally affect the productivity level in the economy because of the composition effect. So does it actually give rise to hysteresis or no? It seems that the answer is no, but I couldn't quite understand why. The third question is, so does the sort of in standard new Keynesian world, which is, I understand you're departing from, the price dispersion is really important. So distribution of prices is really, really important. Do you have anything to say about this in this model? And the final question is is actually a factual question. So one thing which is interesting in your example is that when you have let's say a recession, the share of unskilled labor goes up. I understand the mechanics, but I wonder if it's actually true in the data, because one thing I think from Rebello and others that I know is that the crises are usually times when you sort of clean the economy from the non-productive firms. I'm not sure about the non-productive employees, but so I wonder if you actually have the data, and if you look at the sort of distribution of employment after the demand shocks, do you actually see that the share of the low skilled labor or low productivity labor is actually going up or no? Thank you very much.
Wow, what great questions. So in terms of the news shock, yeah, absolutely. So at time T0, I could say nothing's different at T0, but everybody knows at T0 plus 1 something's coming. And that would be another thing that we're perfectly set up to do. I haven't looked at that particular case, though I was using an aspect of it, an example I had where people know at T0, not just the T0 has changed, but also T0 plus 1 has changed. And so they're both elements of that example, but there's nothing about the apparatus that would keep me from looking at a question like that. That'd be a very interesting one to look at. In terms of productivity, now there's measured productivity. If you calculate it like a solo residual on, or TFP for this model, what you would see in the example I just described as measured productivity falls. The output of the specialized goods went down, their employment didn't. So there's that aspect with now productivity as a technological fact. How much could you produce if the demand was there? I take that to be exogenous in my model, and that's what's going to determine long run growth. But in the short run, we're certainly going to see productivity moving for the reason you say, basically because of a compositional kind of thing, and because, as I was saying, that the economy isn't configured optimally to deliver what people want. And that's actually related to the third point you were making about price dispersion. Yes, I calculate everything. It's generally equilibrium. I can tell you the value of everything. And the price, in fact, in the paper, if you look for all these examples, there's a plot of what happens to the relative price of these goods. What happens in the case of the demand shock, the relative price of the good falls if it's lower demand. In the case of a supply shock, the relative price of the good goes up. And you might see something that looks similar in terms of the output of the good falls, whether it's demand went down or productivity went down. You'd see something similar in terms of GDP, but the difference there would be relative prices. So price dispersion is very much an important part of it. There's lots of price movement. As I say, along the steady state path, there's unit elasticity of demand. So prices are jumping around quite a bit in response to these shocks. Prices are perfectly flexible. And finally, you were talking about the cleansing effect of recessions and whether it's low skill. I think a main way I expect this to show up in the data is unemployment. I'm kind of thinking what I call unskilled shows up in the data as unemployed. And I want to emphasize that I'm taking a little bit different view of unskilled compared to one that economists, especially microeconomists, often take. Often people think, well, the unskilled, they're less talented, or they're not as smart, or they don't work as hard as something like this. In my model, it all has to do with whether you're positioned to make the stuff people want. And this is very much my view of a recession. So you may be a very talented carpenter. You may have tremendous skills. I mean, I mess up every time I try to hit a nail with a hammer. I know it takes skill to do that. And so in that sense, we could say, well, these people are very high skilled. And yet, if the problem is right now, nobody wants to build a new house, those guys are unemployed. And so the way I'm thinking of it, those formerly skilled people have now joined the ranks of unskilled. That's basically what happens. So great questions. I wonder if I should get back now to some of the details. Okay,
I think that was very, very useful.
Yeah, it was certainly useful for me.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. My
Okay.
problem is I've lost my ability to move my screen. So why would that be? Let me try stopping the share and starting again, see if I can get something fixed with that. Well, I worried about that as a issue. Okay. I worried about that once I stopped the screen, stopped sharing, which I thought would be nice, and I think it was for the discussion, that then I would lose the ability to share the screen. Okay.
So I'm gonna try to stop this and restart the sharing. Okay, let's see if that works.
No, I'm okay. I can share it. It's just that I wasn't able to advance my wasn't able to advance the slides. Okay, here we go.
So we're not in full screen mode now.
Oh, you're not seeing it?
No, we see it. Everything's working, but it's good. It's good.
Yep, it's all good.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so now some of the details. So demand for goods. At time t, there's a set of, I'll call it the set JT of different goods that are being produced. It's going to change all the time. And individual I is going to consume a quantity QI JT of good J. And they do that in order to maximize utility, which I'm going to take to be quadratic in the good. And maybe you think, well, that's another issue I should have mentioned with the others for shortcoming of the paper. What's this with quadratic preferences? Well, there's some advantages and disadvantages of quadratic preferences. One, it's actually really important for what I want to do, and Murphy has made the same point in his work. With quadratic preferences, you have changing elasticity as you move along the demand curve. And you also have the fact that if price is too high, people just don't buy the good. To me, that's very realistic. That's exactly what happens. If you have something like the usual isoelastic demand, that would never happen. With those usual preferences, when the quantity goes towards zero, people are willing to pay an infinite price. So I really like quadratic preferences. There's a disadvantage in that it doesn't make sense if QIJT is growing over time, and it is, it's going to be a growing economy, to say Q bar, this bliss point, is fixed. So the way I'm going to think about that is I'm going to allow this Q bar IJT, this characteristic of the utility preferences, to actually grow along the steady state growth path. And I'm going to pick that, that growth by a second order approximation of log preferences. If I said you had log preferences, kind of a more standard thing, and I took a second order approximation around the steady state growth path, I'll call it QIJT0 is the quantity you consume in steady state. You could take a quadratic expansion and you could calculate what the value of Q bar IJT would be for that expansion. It's going to grow basically with the steady state, and that's the way I'm going to do it. So I'm going to have quadratic preferences with the baseline preference parameters growing along the steady state, the way they would if you had logarithmic preferences. And I'm going to claim the best of both worlds with this. So it's basically the log preferences are there in red, and a quadratic approximation is there in black. So in some ways, it's a standard thing we do, except that I'm reversing it. The standard thing is we say, well, the true preferences are log, and I'm going to approximate them with quadratic. I'm saying, no, the true preferences are quadratic, and I'm going to approximate them along the steady state with log. So anyway, that's how I'm going to deal with that issue. And then for Doug's question, I'm going to model a shock to demand as this parameter Q bar IJT in some period T may not be that value would be along the steady state growth path. There's going to be a shock parameter chi JT, which equals 1 along the steady state growth path, but there might be lower demand in the sense that consumers really don't like this good as much in period T, or higher demand. And those are what I'm thinking of in terms of demand shocks. And along the steady state growth path also, the fraction of income people spend on good one. Good one is the good that anybody can produce. It's a competitive market, doesn't take any skills. That's going to count for 40% of spending in terms of people's preferences. That's an assumption about preferences. Along the steady state path, you want to spend 40% of your income on good one. So what that means is if you add up what all the consumers are doing, you literally get the linear demand curve from Econ 1, and you literally get the marginal revenue curve. And what it means is that if you've got capacity with zero marginal costs, you want to produce at this value Q bar JT over 2. That's the profit maximizing level. And so when preferences change so that Q bar J number changes, goes down, you're going to cut production and cut price. Okay, so that's the way I'm thinking about demand. Now, production of the specialized goods, as I say, good one can be produced by anybody. Other goods can only be produced if you have a dedicated team assembled and trained in advance. There's going to be a number of people on that team called capital NJT. That's going to be determined at time T-1, because the only way you got on this team is to go through training and be selected. There's a productivity per person. That's exogenous, but I'm thinking of this as an indivisible group. You can't just let one worker on your team go. Everybody's necessary. XJT is just a summary of what you do on average, in the sense you take the number of people you have multiplied by XJT, that's your capacity. So that's predetermined at date T. And what the enterprise wants to do, I think of these as sort of worker-owned consortiums. The workers get all the profits here, and they operate to maximize profits. What they do is if they have enough capacity to produce the profit maximizing level, Q bar JT over 2, that's what they do. Otherwise, they're limited by by capacity. And then I'm going to assume that they potentially add workers to the team. You can't fire anybody, but you can potentially add workers. And I assume they do so as to maximize expected profits of the team next period. There's also a productivity shock built in here. The productivity shock is going to affect XJT. There's a value productivity on the steady state growth path. This cited JT is a potential shock. Maybe we're more productive at producing good J, or less productive at producing good J at time T. Look at those. And as I say, this demand shock, this change in preferences is going to affect your production through Q bar JT. And as I said, they're going to hire workers next period so as to maximize expected profits. I won't try to go out of screen share, but maybe I should pause again there to see if there are questions about that.
Jim, you're muted.
How long has that been going on?
This is just a few seconds.
Okay. Technology is marvelous. Unskilled workers, let's consider an unskilled worker. I assume that the goal of the unskilled worker is to maximize the discounted expectation of the log of their income. And that's the function you'd care about if you had those log preferences I talked about that I'm using to characterize what these quadratic preferences are doing. So an unskilled worker is going to choose between three things. First option is to produce good one. Anybody can do that. And individual I has some productivity at producing good I at date T, whose log xit is uniformly distributed. And so there's a range of unskilled individuals. Some of them this period turn out to be really good at producing the unskilled goods. Others turn out this period not to be so good. It's the ones who are not so good this period who are going to be the ones who are induced to try to develop a skill, try to develop a new good. But this productivity is going to be IID over time. So just because you're productive as an unskilled today has no implications for whether you'd be productive or not as an unskilled next period. So if you choose option one, we can calculate your value function, that expression there. Oh dear, so now I unmuted myself, but I'm again, my screen is frozen. Why does this happen?
Try scrolling with the mouse.
Yeah, I'm trying that.
Huh.
Neither the mouse, oh, there we go. Boy, I have no idea. So a second thing an unskilled person could do is say, well, I want to create a new good. I'm hoping to join a team of other people who are unskilled right now. We're going to get together as a group and we're going to try to create a new good. And this is costly. It's not fun to try to launch a new product. You're going to have some sleepless nights. I'm just going to model that as a direct shock to your utility function. You pay KU if you try to create a new good, and you may not succeed. There's a probability K pi that you will succeed, and a probability 1 minus K pi that you won't. And I'm thinking of both KU and K pi as technological parameters. These are the key frictions. It's not that easy to create a new good. And I'm just taking these as exogenous givens from the technology. And these are the key frictions in the model. If KU went to 0 and K pi went to 1, there would be no monopoly income sustained in the equilibrium growth path, and none of this stuff I'm talking about would happen. These are the core friction. If you do try to create a new good, you're going to be unemployed this period. You spend all your time doing that. You're not going to produce good one. I allow these people to collect unemployment compensation. If they do that, it's financed with a tax on the skilled workers. Only the skilled workers are taxed. They pay to compensate the unskilled unemployed. And if you choose that option, your utility will your lifetime utility, this period, you're going to pay that cost KU. You're going to have a probability K pi, you're going to get a lifetime value of a new skilled good. And by the way, I'm going to assume that new goods enter with a parameter configuration that is the same as along the steady state growth path. So you get that return if you're successful, probably 1 minus K pi that you're still unskilled despite your efforts. And then a third option is you can train to specialize in an existing good. You know at time t which goods J are going to have potential openings at t+1. You know at date t how many people are going to be applying for those. You choose to try to specialize yourself. You can try to specialize in an existing good. And your probability of success there is based on the number of openings in that good relative to the number of people who apply. The number of people who apply is going to be determined in equilibrium, such that pi jt makes people just indifferent, basically, between applying with an existing good and or trying to create a new good. So if you choose to do that, your lifetime utility is you also collect unemployment compensation. If you're training to try to get an existing specialized job, you're unemployed this period, you're going to collect this CT. With probably pi JT, you're going to be successfully hired with enterprise J, and otherwise you're going to stay unskilled. So your lifetime value at time A is one of these three things, depending on which you choose. You can choose to stay unskilled, you can choose to try to create a new good, or you can choose to try to specialize in an existing good. And every individual at time I is going to choose the best option among those three. And what they choose is going to be a function of XIT. As I say, the people who have high XIT, a high probability of producing the unskilled, high productivity of producing the unskilled good, are going to choose to do that this period. And the people with lower productivity this period are going to choose to try to do one of the other things. And so the solution is characterized by a cutoff, X1T star, productivity cutoff, such that everybody who has productivity higher than X1T star is going to choose to produce the undifferentiated good. And everybody with lower probability is going to choose one of the other options. And in equilibrium, this pi JT, this probability of getting a job with a continuing specialized good, is going to adjust in equilibrium so that the marginal worker is just indifferent between trying to create a new good, assuming new goods are created, and trying to join an existing good. It's also possible to have equilibrium where in some period no new goods are produced, or in some periods no existing goods are hiring. But in the typical case, they're both happening, and pi JT adjusts to make that true. Okay, so there's a steady state growth path. And so maybe I don't want to go into too much of this detail. The various equations, the fiscal policy is balanced, the taxes collected from the skilled equal the unemployment compensation to the unskilled. There's an equation of motion for the, sorry, question?
Wondering, just to make sure that everybody has it up to this point, okay? Does everybody have this setup of the model? Or do we need maybe it explained a little bit? Is there anybody that is having issues with kind of the choices about these three options and what the equilibrium condition is?
Yeah, so the three options, you can produce good one, and you have some productivity at doing that, and you can try to create a new good. You got some chance that that's going to work, some chance it's not. You can try to train to produce join an existing team if they're hiring, and there's some probability that's determined in equilibrium that you're going to be successful with that. And the equilibrium is going to be characterized by a level of productivity x1t star, such that everybody with productivity above that produces the good one. Everybody with productivity below that either tries to create a new good or join an existing team. So I think rather than try to do all the math, let me just briefly mention this equation, I guess. So there's an equation of motion for the fraction of the population that's unskilled. N1 at time t plus 1 is going to depend on N1t, the number that are unskilled now. There's going to be in steady state a fraction of goods that are discontinued every period. That fraction is denoted kx. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows whatever good I have now, the market is fickle. People may lose interest in that. There's probably kx that demand is going to be low enough for long enough for my good that I'm going to be forced to disband. So there's an inflow of new unskilled every period, kx times the number of previous skilled, which is 1 minus n1t. And then there's flows out of the unskilled from people creating successfully new goods. There's a probability anybody who tries to create a new good of k pi that they succeed. There's a fraction 1 minus h1 of people who are unskilled and who are trying, who are unemployed, and then a fraction h naught of those that are trying to create new goods. So basically, I mean, without thinking about the symbols, the next period's value of N1 is determined by the number of people that are newly unskilled because their goods are discontinued, minus the number of people who are newly skilled because they successfully created a new job, a new good. And that's what that equation of motion ends up looking like. And so the three key variables are N1, this fraction of the population that's unskilled, X1 star, this productivity cutoff whereby people who are unskilled decide whether they are not going to bother trying to produce good one, but look for something else. And H naught, which is the fraction of the unskilled who try to create new goods. And so one of the propositions in the paper is there exists a unique value for those three variables. There exists a unique fraction along the steady state growth path of the population that's unskilled. There exists a unique cutoff of productivity at which they decide to try to look for something better. And there exists a unique fraction of people trying to create new goods for which all the equations hold. And that's what the steady state growth path looks like. So along the steady state growth path, what happens is I take it as an assumption that this productivity xjt in steady state for any good j is going to grow at rate g. That in steady state, there's a fraction of kx goods that are discontinued every period. And there's a constant fraction of the population trying to create new goods. So what happens is the number of goods discontinued along the steady state growth path equals the number of goods newly created. Along the steady state growth path, there's a constant lifetime income advantage to being skilled. It's the same for every good J. It turns out to be an equilibrium result. Along the steady state growth path, each firm always has exactly the capacity, no more, no less, to meet the demand. And along the steady state growth path, the productivity, the output of every good that survives is going to grow at the rate of population growth plus productivity. Okay, and then have various equations for deviations from steady state, the characterized to a linear approximation, the adjustment path back toward that steady state if for some reason you didn't start out there. And I guess let me spend the rest of my time just kind of going through some examples of what the model looks like. I started the talk with one example. I want to do some other examples now. So to do a numerical example, I'm going to fix some of these parameters. Let me just mention some of the values I use. Alpha 1 is the steady state share of spending on the undifferentiated good 1. Tau is the marginal tax rate. 2%, that sounds very low. The only thing taxes do in this model is to provide unemployment compensation. That's the only role for the government. And so value 0.02 matches some of the things we see in unemployment compensation. I'm going to calibrate this to think of one period as a quarter. So take an annual discount rate of like 2%. The utility costs of trying to create a new good and probability of creating a new good, KU, K pi. As I say, those are key parameters. Those are the key frictions that are driving everything. Baseline numbers, I'll use those values. There's a fraction of 2% of goods that are discontinued every period along the steady state growth path. It maybe sounds like a lot. It roughly matches the gross flows of what seem to be inflows of involuntarily unemployed people each period in typical healthy growing economy. Take the annual population growth rate to be 1% and a spread on the productivity of the unskilled. And so you take those values for the exogenous parameters, they imply values for various steady state magnitudes. So for example, the steady state fraction of unskilled is 44%. That turns out to be the equilibrium implication. And so if you remember, the unskilled goods account for 40% of spending. They account for 44% of the people. And so that difference between 44% of the people and the 40% of GDP that they earn is basically the summary of the advantage to skill. There are more skilled people relative to their share, more unskilled people relative to their share of what they produce. There's a fraction, about 11% of the unskilled workers who are unemployed any given period along the steady state growth path. That implies an equilibrium unemployment rate of 5%. So the unemployment rate is going to be constant at 5% along the steady state growth path. That number I could change if I change things like the cost of creating a new good or the probability of creating a new good. And then there's a discounted lifetime log income differential from being skilled relative to being unskilled that turns out to be 4.8. Okay, so let me, the rest of my time, give some examples of what this looks like. So start with examples of demand shocks. First example, all the variables going to start out at day T0 at their steady state values, except that 25% of goods, specialized goods, have a demand 10% below the steady state. So I'm going to take chi j T0 to be 0.9 for 25% of the specialized goods at time T0. And this is just going to be a one period shock. Demand is going to go back to normal at time T0 plus 1. Everybody knows that at time T0. So what happens? Well, the impacted goods have capacity to produce more. Demand at the moment, that demand parameter is 10% lower than on the steady state. So what they choose to do, their profit maximizing response to that lower demand is to lower production by 10%, lower the price by 10%. And the first approximation, everything's going to return to normal next period. There's some more complications. I think I won't spell those out. they're not too important. But so basically, here's what the story looks like for that example. There's essentially no change in the fraction of workers without skills over time. That's always the steady state value for this example, because we just had a one-time shock at time T naught, but everybody deciding whether I'm going to stay unskilled depends on what I see as the return to trying to train for skill next period, and that's roughly returning to the steady state. And so what happens here is real GDP falls essentially by that 1.5%. You have about 44% of the goods experiencing a 10% drop in demand in period T0. There's no place that demand spells over. It's just the profit maximizing decision in response to that change in consumers' preferences is to lower production of those goods. Real GDP falls in period T naught, and everything's back to normal at time T naught plus 1. So I kept using this word almost. There's a little bit of a general equilibrium effect, which arises from the fact that there are a little bit lower taxes collected from the skilled workers. And so there's a little bit less unemployment compensation, and that factors in a little bit into the future decisions. It's definitely a second order effect for these parameter values, and I'm not going to spend too much time with that. Okay, so second example. Again, time T0, I'm going to start off everybody at the steady state values, except that 25% of the specialized goods, in this case, have extra demand. IJ T naught is going to be 1.1, bigger than 1, higher than normal demand, rather than 0.9 in my first example, where we have less than usual demand. And again, I'm going to assume this is just a one period shock, period T naught plus 1. Everything's going to return to steady state. Everybody knows that. So in this case, no specialized good has any incentive to change production. Sure, demand is higher, but that's not going to, you can't raise production because you're at capacity at time T naught. So all you do is raise price. In this case, you're going to raise the price of impacted goods by 20%, and everything's back to normal at time T naught plus 1. So to a first approximation, in this case, there's no effect on anything. Demand goes up, no boom. In contrast to when demand went down, we saw real GDP fall. Now, actually, if you look carefully at this little diagram, if you can see it well enough on the figure, you'll see real GDP actually falls a little bit, very tiny bit at time T naught. Why is that? Well, it's because there's a little bit more unemployment compensation collected by the unskilled, because these skilled guys have raised their prices. So they're getting a higher relative income. And that's a little bit higher unemployment compensation. So more people are saying, hey, this unemployment's a better deal than normal. I'm not going to produce good one. So there's actually a little drop in real GDP. Real GDP actually falls in this example in response to an increase in demand. But it's definitely a second order effect arising through unemployment compensation. So first approximation, increase in demand has no stimulus, decrease in demand has a big effect. Okay, third example. Again, I'm going to have all variables start out at time T naught at their steady state value. In this case, I'm going to have a big drop in demand, 50%. I'm going to assume it just affects, however, 5% of the specialized goods. So it's the same total shock to demand as the first example. It's a bigger shock per firm, fewer firms affected. It's also going to be different from the first example. So it's the same aggregate size shock, more intense for certain sectors. And unlike my first example where I said the shock just lasts for one period and then it goes away, so it doesn't affect anybody's calculations about the future. In this case, everybody knows it's going to last for 8 periods. Everybody knows for 2 years, demand for good J, if they're an impacted good, is going to be in the toilet. And so for this example, if you're one of the guys specialized in this good that is going to be hard to sell, hard to make a profit, for the next couple of years, you would actually choose to give up your specialization that good is going to be no longer produced after period T naught plus 1. And I assume that decision is forever. Once you stop producing the good, you don't have the specialized resources assembled. It's never going to continue again. So basically 5% of the specialized goods are going to produce in period T naught because they've already got the resources there, but then they're going to give up and join the ranks of the unskilled. So here are plots of what happens in that case. I've got in panel A, the unskilled workers, like I've been showing you for the others, and panel E, GDP. So those are the two I was showing you for other cases. Here I also illustrate there are a bunch of other things you can calculate. So for example, in panel B is the advantage to skilled workers who did not see this fall in demand. And basically it's a benefit to them. There's lower demand for these certain goods. That increases the income advantage of the people who are lucky enough to be skilled in producing a good people still want. So that goes up. In panel D is the lifetime advantage of being specialized in the unskilled good. So here people are looking at the fact they know that after 8 periods, this is going to be a good deal again. Demand's going to be back. But you got to go through 8 periods with very low income to get there. And in fact, for this example, when you look at things at time T0, you decide to give up production. And so in this case, then there's a surge in the unskilled beginning in period T naught plus 1, because all these guys quit producing the good they had done before. That's going to gradually return to normal over time. So beginning in T naught plus 1, there are no demand impacted goods. All the goods that face lower demand have quit. All the other goods, newly created goods, have no shortfall in demand. Why is GDP still below a steady state in period T naught plus 1? The answer is because we had this surge in unskilled workers. And that's causing the economy to produce less than it would in steady state. That's lowering demand. It's this thing I was calling like a Keynesian multiplier effect. And so it takes time. It's a gradual process over time whereby the economy eventually is going to get back to the steady state. It was a one-time, the impact of the shock was all at time T0, but the consequences of it through the feedback from N1 continue for some time. Now, next example, I'm going to take exactly the same thing. 5% of the goods have a 50% drop in demand. It's going to last for 8 periods. Again, it turns out all those impacted goods are going to want to quit producing. The only difference here is I'm going to change the technological frictions. So the black was the baseline case where I had probability of successfully creating a new good if you try is 25%. For the red, I'm going to look at an economy where it's much easier to create a new good. You got a 60% chance if you try of succeeding. Exactly the same initial shock, exactly the same initial drop to real GDP, exactly the same initial surge in number of unskilled, but there's a much more rapid adjustment back to steady state in the red case, where there are fewer technological frictions compared to the black case, and there's much smaller drop in real GDP. People can get new jobs, find new things to do much more quickly when there are fewer technological frictions in creating a new good, and so it's much less disruptive for this example. Fifth example, this is actually the one I showed you at the beginning, and now you know what you were seeing. So 25% of the goods experience a 10% drop in demand. So these numbers, the size of the drop, like 10% in this case, 25%, the product is always 2.5%. 10 times 25 is 2.5. 50 times 0.5 is 2.5. So it's the same shock to demand in each case. It's just the difference is the persistence, and the difference is how intensive it is for any individual good. So in this case, you say, well, okay, I've got this good. Consumers aren't wanting it as much for the next 5 periods. but it's not that big a drop. I still have an income. In fact, I still have an income advantage that's enough to compensate me to stick with the specialization I have, to wait it out. So these guys are going to want to wait out the downturn. But as long as demand is low, there's no incentive for them to do new hiring. And I'm also going to assume in this example that this low demand is going to characterize any newly created good. And so there's less incentive to create new goods. There's less opportunity, less employment opportunity to join existing goods because none of these demand impacted goods are going to do any hiring. And so the adjustment path is shown in turquoise here. The top panel is the fraction of the workers without skills. The bottom panel is real GDP. That's exactly the example I showed you in the beginning, where there's initially no change in real GDP, but the effects on real GDP accumulate as this number of unskilled goes up over time, because those unskilled people don't see the advantage to trying to create a new good. They don't see as many opportunities in trying to join existing goods. And that brings GDP down, and it stays down. Also here, I've shown all the examples. So the different cases of whether it's a temporary shock to demand, that's a green line, temporary increase in demand, that's the dash blue, the drop in demand that forces a bunch of guys out in black, and the same drop with fewer frictions in red. So you can kind of see there are lots of different possibilities. Lower demand can have very different effects depending on where the demand is concentrated and depending on where it's going to, how long it's going to last. But in all these examples, drops in demand can have quite significant effects on real GDP. Now, I've been talking all this time about demand shocks. You can also have productivity shocks. So let me talk a little bit about those. So first example is one that kind of parallels what I was doing with demand. I'm going to assume 25% of the specialized goods experience a 10% drop in productivity now, and it's just going to last for one period. Okay, so what does a enterprise that's suddenly less able to produce stuff do? Well, they have to cut back production. They're going to cut back, they're forced basically to cut back production by 10% because that's what they can't produce. They can only produce 90% of what they used to. They're going to charge the profit maximizing price as a consequence. Well, if we produce less, we can raise the price. We'll raise the price by 10%. And again, for this example, the non-impacted goods, there's no change. And so here's what the adjustment paths look like for this case. And I've actually plotted this case to side by side with the first example I showed you in the details of demand shock. So the demand shock is in black. In that case, people want to buy 10% less of good J for the impacted goods. The productivity shock is in red. In this case, those impacted producers could not produce as much as they normally do. If you look, the time path for GDP is identical. So in either case, we had a drop in GDP. We had no change in the number of people working. So in either case, we see a drop in productivity, measured productivity, output per worker, GDP per worker. Goes down with the demand shock because output went down with employment constant. Goes down with a productivity shock because output went down with employment constant. They would look the same in terms of GDP. You'd see output of, and it's all coming from the impacted sectors. It's specifically a decline in the production of the goods that have lower demand, an example 9.1, goods that have lower productivity in the productivity shock 10.1. The one difference is in the lower right panel there, where I plot the relative price of those goods that are impacted in the black case by lower demand or impacted in the red case by lower productivity. That's where you'd see the difference. If it's lower demand, those goods lower their relative price. If it's lower productivity, those goods raise their relative price. And that's really the only way you could distinguish between these two. Now, as came up in the questions earlier, so the productivity shocks here, just like in the standard model, and maybe in some ways they look a lot like in the standard model. You could kick around GDP in the short run because of a short run drop in productivity, and that's all true. So the reason I've been emphasizing demand so much more than productivity is that in many of the models people are using now, productivity is the only game. If you have perfectly flexible wages and prices, that's the only way you could get output to respond. And I want to emphasize, no, it can respond to demand. As I said at the beginning, my view is that demand shocks are a big thing that we see going on. So here that just mentions what I said, that the difference between them is you'd see relative prices. But the big issue for is what would have caused this to happen. So in terms of demand shocks, the way I'm modeling them, some goods people just don't want as much as they used to. I think that's very much what we see happen all the time. Preferences change. What used to be in style isn't in style now. Something better has come along and people don't need that old thing so much. I think we see that all the time. Why would productivity fall? Well, we have examples of that too. Natural disasters. We were talking about COVID a little earlier. Obviously, there are examples there. My view is that it's harder to come up with examples for a typical economic recession where you could say, here was the reason we physically couldn't produce as much as we did the quarter before. I think it's very easy to come up with examples where people didn't want those particular goods as much as they did before. And that's why I focused on the demand shocks. The model says all kinds of things can cause short-run deviations from steady state. I've emphasized demand shocks because I think that's an interesting new feature of the model, but it also has, some of the familiar features. Sure, productivity can matter. As I said, productivity is the sole driver of long-run growth. There's a steady state fraction of the skilled, which is uniquely determined by these technological parameters. And given that, the growth along the steady state path is going to be determined entirely by population growth and productivity growth. Okay, so there is the details of the paper, which I maybe rushed through more than I should have because Doug said I did have, we did have 2 hours for this, but he also mentioned that people might be interested in discussing both these issues or others. So let me open it up again to comments now that you've seen the details of what I did.
So again, while people are getting warmed up, I will jump in here, okay? So the way that you presented this, right? It's like there are some shocks that happen that might cause business cycles, right? And you kind of said, well, it's easier to think of demand shocks, stories about demand shocks than supply shocks and so on. But when I was thinking about like your model and your story, I could think of just, let me give you an example. We discover electricity, okay? And discovering electricity turns out to be really important because that sets in motion the possibility that people can create new goods, right? This happened over, decades, okay? Like we got remember Howdy Doody on TV?
I do.
So James and I remember Howdy Doody on TV and so on. Then we remember cars, getting a car kind of, we used to get cars every 7 years. And then all of a sudden we started getting cars every 3 years and so on. Now, of course, it's back up to 12 years or whatever. But the thing is that people were creating all these things, okay? But the fundamental base for it was productivity, okay? So if you think of business cycles as you just have these booms that can last for some period of time, they're kind of random, and they're, you know, maybe the fundamentals behind it is supply, opening up the possibility for people to specialize and so on. Then there can just come a time when basically the thing matures, okay? Now you throw in the financial system, which allows this, you know, where all this stuff, all this real stuff interacts with, you know, you have to get some, you know, some resources to basically finance these booms. Then I think you know, you have a story. But the way you're telling the story, it's kind of like there's some shocks that happen. And then that causes the, you know, the business cycle and so on, right? So anyway, that's when I was listening to your story, I was thinking about something even, you know, potentially bigger than just this kind of proximate cause thing about, you know, how we would think of business cycles. But I don't know what your reaction to it. That was.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and important insight. And you're exactly right. In terms of my model, these key parameters characterizing what you can do when you create a new good, K pi and KU, are fixed all time. Recession, boom, those are fixed numbers. And that bought me a lot in terms of the tractability of the model. And okay, here's what the steady state looks like. I may be missing quite a bit from, you know, some of the really interesting kind of issues you're talking about. Let me make a comment about the way productivity operates in this model that kind of surprised me as I got into the details. So in some ways, it's not so important what this XJT is, which is saying how many units of this thing can I produce? Because in some ways that's just units. I mean, if I measured the quantity of goods in bushels of potatoes instead of pounds of potato, you know, I would change the units of XJT. The issue is not really how many potatoes can I produce. It's how much do people want them? And so the key thing that's really going on in my model for the income advantage of the specialists is not that they're productive in terms of XJT. It's that they've restricted employment in their sector relative to the share people want to spend on it. So the real thing that matters is how much of people's income do they want to spend on these goods. That's what really matters more than how many of them can I produce. So, you know, my intuition was a little bit off when I first started playing with them all. I was kind of thinking of productivity in a little different way. You know, when we have an aggregate like represented firm model, we very much think, okay, productivity, I see what that's doing. Here, when we're talking about relative output, relative prices, it turns out in this model, it's kind of more important how much consumers want the good. That's what creating a new good is, creating something people want, that they're willing to hand over a certain fraction of their income to get. But I love your point about electricity and sort of these big issues, and absolutely I'm ignoring them all just from the details of how I solved the model.
I think for the audience here, because they're from all over the world, right? So some of these countries wouldn't be exploiting the basics of electricity yet, right? So they're, you know, not every country is the, you know, the United States or an advanced economy. So this kind of interaction between supply. So I was thinking about, you know, those things as being potentially state variables, whereas what you were doing is asking.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. So when I do GDP, I was measuring it relative to steady state. That's kind of my metric. So it's very much an internal economy comparison. I'm not really even sure how if I had two insular economies, how I'd compare GDP one with the other. I haven't really thought about that question. So it's very much, in the way I'm organizing it, a question of what's being produced relative to what people want.
So please put your hand up so I can acknowledge you. But the other thing is, like, it's not clear in my mind what you're actually solving, right? Because you have an asymmetry, because you talked about a case where you're at capacity and you had an increase in demand, and it showed up all in price. And then you had a contraction in demand where it showed up in a combination of price and quantity. Are you, like, you have a bunch of equations, some that have some non-linearities. Are you basically solving a nonlinear perfect Foresight problem? Or?
Well, yeah, so I skipped all through those details. But no, to do the dynamics, I linearize around the steady state. So it's the usual thing we do so that I get linear difference equations and can solve them forward. But you have different regimes within that linearization, depending on whether your good J is supply constrained or demand constrained. So but it is linearized. To get those paths, I was linearizing, and then there's some internal consistency. So, for example, if some of the goods drop out, you have a different adjustment path compared to if they don't. So that's an example of a nonlinearity. So the way I handle that is I solve it under the conjecture that nobody drops out, and if I know there is an incentive for somebody to drop out, and then you get, try it under another conjecture. So it's kind of a hybrid. I am taking the nonlinearities into account, but for a given solution path, I'm actually using linearization.
So why don't you just solve the nonlinear problem?
Because I'm not smart enough to know how to do that.
Okay.
How are you suggesting I solve it?
Just solve it as a nonlinear. You have your nonlinear equations. Okay. You stack them up and use a standard Newton algorithm for solving a nonlinear system of equations.
It's a nonlinear system of difference equations.
Precisely. So you've got some leads. You stack up those difference equations, those nonlinear difference equations, and solve it as a 2-point boundary problem. So if you know the steady state of the model, if the steady state change, you compute that. You've got the existing steady state, and you draw a line between the two things. We're good at that. You might end up with a matrix that ends up being pretty high dimensional, but we can solve those kinds of problems with hundreds of thousands of, stacked equations very robustly and very efficiently.
Maybe you should send me a link to how you're doing that. I didn't know how to do it for the model that I have, and that may be my limitation.
Yeah, it's quite straightforward. But does anybody have some questions? Armin? Oh, by the way, we have to say, okay, we have a very, very important decision to make, is why we aren't allowed to use the HP filter. So should we put that off to the side and ask
Well, let's hear from Armin first, and then we can get into HP or whatever.
I would actually talk about HP filter, with great pleasure as well. But I have two questions, maybe interrelated as well. So I actually was quite surprised when I saw that if you compare supply and demand shocks, the key variable, which is the share of unskilled labor, behaves in a very, very similar way. So the difference between these two and I kind of don't know, it's hard for me to catch the intuition, because maybe it's my own sort of prejudice, because you think if there is a problem with supply, then actually people rush to it. In my intuition, and I was actually thinking there will be a difference between this variable. So can you sort of explain me the intuition, why do we have very similar behavior in that sense? And the second question is maybe it's out of scope and complicates the thing too much, but it would also help me to think about this stuff. So let's say we have an oil price shock. So would this in your framework, would you sort of categorize it as a negative supply shock?
Okay, great questions. First one, so the reason supply and demand looked so similar in that example was those two were just one period shocks. And so everything's back to normal next period. So there's no allocating resources to be there for demand or be there for supply or whatever. That was one of the things that made those examples kind of simple. You're exactly right. If I had future productivity being affected, that's going to have some different potential feedback effect. So I think that's the answer to the first. And as far as the oil price shock goes, I'd give a similar answer to the one I gave when we were talking about COVID a little earlier, which is I think it's both. I think an oil shock is affecting both demand and supply. I've always believed, for example, that a key thing that happens is when consumers see the price of gasoline going up, they want fewer of the cars that Detroit in the US is specialized in producing, the fuel inefficient cars. And so you see a big drop in demand for those particular goods that people are specialized for. So now, as I was saying, I don't have any of these links in my model between, one good's demand or production, depends on what somebody else does, but that's exactly what I think goes on. And in addition, of course, it may be something that, well, it's obviously a shock physically to what can be produced in the petroleum sector. I mean, that's the way to think about it. It was fundamentally a productivity shock there. And so I think it's a good illustration, this point I'm making, that demand and supply should not be treated in the aggregate representative firm kind of way that we often do in macro. Instead, it's a micro phenomena of some goods are going to be affected in terms of demand, other goods are going to be affected in terms of supply. I've always believed that in the case of oil shock, if you try to tell a pure supply story, it's hard to explain why economies are so sensitive to this thing that's such a small share of total spending. It's not at all hard to see why an economy like the United States, when the auto industry shuts down, that would have pretty big effects.
Can I ask one more question and I will shut up, I promise.
Yeah,
You've asked great questions. I
you
don't
don't
want
have
you to
to
shut
shut
up.
up. You can, what is your question?
So usually again, because, we all are like monetary policy guys who love monetary policy. I think the monetary policy solves all the issues in the world. So one key thing which sort of helps me to think about these issues usually is the consumption smoothing. And so that's sort of the fundamental micro driver of things, that is something that you're fighting with monetary policy because you want to get to the optimal point. So, and in one of your experiments, you sort of talked about this kind of experiment where in future, future is coming, it's bright, but you still have to do some kind of a optimization in between, and you want to survive. So is there a role for consumption smoothing type of sort of logic in this model, or we're totally abstracting from this?
There's no consumption smoothing in the sense that there's no saving. There's no vehicle to save money. Everybody's always spending exactly their income. And that is one of the things that makes it very tractable to look at. Now, there is, however, forward-looking. So my objective function is the expected discounted log of my income. And I'm going to look at every element of that when I decide, do I want to stay with this good or not? And so in that sense, there's some, you might call it something like smoothing, in that I say, well, this is just for a few periods. And I don't want to give up my specialization because I know in a few periods I'm going to have it good times again. I'm going to stay where I am and stick it out. That's the sense in which it happens, but it's not the usual consumption smoothing. It's not that I'm making marginal utility of consumption, the same across periods, because I don't have any device for doing that. And as I acknowledged at the beginning, I think that's a shortcoming of the model, obviously. Capital markets saving all that stuff is, the bread and butter basics of macro. And I've abstracted from everything just to make this kind of narrow point about the role of specialization and demand.
So I seem to have more questions, but I think I've hit my own limit in terms of questions. And so are there any other questions, other types of questions? Obviously, James has worked on oil extensively. He's also written this paper with this interesting title, Why We Should Never Use the HP Filter. But I'm more interested in what you people want to ask. So why should we not use how many people want to know why we should never use the HP filter? Okay. Does anybody want to know the answer to that? How many of you use the HP filter? Okay. No, now we've got lots of hands being raised. Go ahead.
Oh, so now I have to answer now that everybody's.
No. We've got that provoked a bunch of people to ask questions.
Okay, well, never was a provocative word in the title, and maybe you'll give me a little slack for that. But the main concern I have about the HP filter is that it is not uncovering any characteristic of the data generating process. It kind of generates these graphs that look appealing to us. We kind of think there's some kind of story like, oh, when credit is higher relative to GDP than it usually is, we're maybe about to have bad things happen, because we see that as an outcome when we apply the HP filter. The thing you have to be very careful about that is that the HP filter by its nature is forward-looking. What the HP filter says is the trend at time t is different from what it's going to say the trend at time t was when it can look at the data 10 years later. And in particular, if you look at something like a credit to GDP ratio, and you see that we had a financial crisis when credit collapsed, ex post, you go back and say, oh, credit was really high before this event. And it really had nothing to do with credit. It has everything to do with way that it's a structure you've imposed on the data. It didn't come from the data, these patterns we see in HP filter. And I suppose it depends on why you wanted to do it in the first place. I think the canonical application is people have data, it has some kind of trend, some kind of non-stationarity. They don't know where that comes from. They don't want to model that specifically. They want to characterize correlations or patterns apart from the trend, cyclical patterns. So they apply the HP filter for that. And the other reason why I say never in that title is because there's a way you can handle that, which is totally based on the data generating process, which we can say, here's exactly what I'm uncovering when I do this. And that's to interpret the cyclical component as the part you could not have predicted in advance 2 years ago. And that's a well-defined population object. It exists for most any kind of process you could write down, and you can get a consistent estimate of it without knowing what the nature of the process is. You just do a regression, and for a 2-year horizon, a long enough data set, you can get a reasonable answer to that question of what's the forecast error. So my recommendation is, let's talk about that object. It doesn't suffer from this ex post fitting the data problem. It doesn't suffer from I'm imposing some kind of structure on the data that's not there, or seeing some kind of pattern in the data that's not there. I'm characterizing something that's very much part of the data training process. And so to me, that's a more appealing way to go for most applications. Now, I should say there are lots of applications where you wouldn't want to do that. And that's the case where you know the nature of the non-stationary. You know something about what's happening with demographics or whatever it is that's generating what you think is the trend. And I think we'd all agree, if you really have the right understanding of that, you should model that directly. You know, don't do this silly regression of mind. You should characterize the trend directly. But if you do that, you shouldn't HP filter either. So I don't know about never. You know, maybe you could give some example. The guys at the BIS says, oh, well, you know, we can do it for credit to GDP. And I think they're dead wrong on that. I think that's the clearest example where you definitely shouldn't be doing this.
I would agree with you 100%. But on the BIS stuff, it's really simple. The way to argue this, you just look at how it detrends the credit to GDP ratio in China. So, you know, their credit to GDP ratio over the last couple of decades has gone from 100% to 200%, and it's flattened out recently. And so I think if you just know the underlying stochastic process that's behind the HP filter, so you don't think of it as an optimization problem, but you realize that the underlying stochastic process is that there's a gap that's white noise, and that the second difference of the trend is also white noise. And so if, you know, with the flattening out of the credit to GDP ratio, the model's forecast of the credit to GDP ratio is basically just the last observation of the change in the, you know, in the trend, right? So if the gap is 0 and you forecast the gap to be 0 forever, and you'd forecast it to grow along that trend. And if the trend has been going from 100 to 200%, you would forecast that even with a 0 gap, that it could go from 200 to 400% over the next, you know, over the next period of time, which is clearly, you know, absurd. Okay. And so just by going through a conceptual experiment about how would the HP filter actually work in an environment where, you know, the credit to GDP ratio could double, and it wouldn't indicate that there's a problem in terms of computing what the credit gap is, I think is showing the potential problems. But you also talk about you know, the econometric implications of pre-filtering data. And this is also relevant to things like the Phillips curve, because if you use the HP filter to measure the output gap and you stick it in the Phillips curve, it's very easy to show that you're going to bias the coefficient on the output gap to 0, and it's going to induce change terms in the Phillips curve. In other words, you know, if your level of the output gap is, you know, is wrong in a highly serially correlated way, then obviously you're going to lose that level information in the output gap in you know, in the Phillips curve and so on. So now I think the practical reason why people use the HP filter is that it's just easy, and you know, it kind of buries a lot of uncertainty that people don't really want to, you know, they want to try to ignore that in some way, right? Isn't that?
Yeah, but the regression is easy too. I mean, running a regression is pretty easy. And actually on the Phillips curve, Valder Den Haan had a paper well before mine where he used exactly that idea. Let's look at the error you'd make predicting inflation or prices, and the error you'd make predicting GDP, and look at the correlation between those. And that's a well-defined way to think about what we're looking for in terms of the correlation. Now, as far as credit goes, Oscar's, of course, the real expert on all those issues. But I think one of the core questions is, yeah, sometimes you see a credit boom and it's followed by a disaster. Sometimes you see a credit boom and it's not. And when we use an ex post filter that sort of says, okay, if it was a disaster, then I'm going to, say it was too high. That's a fundamental problem with that methodology.
So do we have any more comments? Alberta, you had your hand up at one point. Was Alberta still there? She's still there.
Yes. Thank you so much for wonderful presentations. Yes, my hand was up only to say that I was interested in knowing why we should, not put so much faith in the HP filter. So basically, that's what I wanted to say, that I was interested in understanding why, we should not put too much faith in the HP filter. And I've gotten a good understanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. So in that paper, I also argue sort of the canonical economic time series is a random walk. You can point to dozens of economic theories that say this variable, that variable should be a random walk. You can point to dozens of papers that say, look, the fanciest model, you can beat it in out of sample forecast with a random walk. And so one of the points I make is a random walk ought to be, if the procedure doesn't work give you the right kind of answer with the random walk, it's not something you should be applying in general to whatever economic or financial series you get. And the nice thing about a random walk is it's very clear. You can see exactly parametrically, here's what would happen if you apply the HP filter to a random walk. And it's generating all these patterns that have nothing to do with the data. And it's really kind of a figment of the modeler's imagination.
Okay. So I have to rush off in 5 minutes, but if you're actually interested, James, about solving nonlinear perfect foresight problems, we can actually solve those things in Dinaire. Have you heard of Dinaire?
Sure. Okay, I thought it linearized.
No. So actually this nonlinear perfect foresight stuff was created before we got into all this linearization. And so it goes back like 30 years, but there's 2 algorithms that are available. They basically just take the difference equation. So you have to have, different nonlinear difference equations. And basically you just think of if yt is a function of yt plus 1, then it's like you just take the y, advance that to yt plus 1. And then if it has yt plus 2, you advance it to yt plus 3 and so on. And so you get a stacked system. If you have to solve, 100 equations for 100 periods, that would be...
You pin down period 100 at the steady state or something.
You pin down it at the steady state, but our algorithms are like so powerful that we can have, like that is, for example, 100 by 100, so it's 10,000. Okay, so it would be an equation system that is 10,000 by 10,000, but it's going to be block triangular. So in other words, it's going to be a very sparse Jacobian, typically like about maybe 95% sparse, full of zeros. And so you need to solve that big problem. And there's 2 ways of solving it. One is my algorithm, which is just using sparse matrix code and a Newton-based algorithm, okay? As long as things are continuous and differentiable, it eats problems up, and they can be hundreds of thousands by hundreds of thousands. So in other words, there's no problem whatsoever. Totally robust, totally efficient. You get answers back. Machine precision. There's no problems with iterating like old first order solution techniques. So that's one algorithm. There's also another algorithm that Michel Gilliard developed, where you take advantage of the sparse nature or the sparse structure of the Jacobian, because when you're dealing with a forward-looking problem, at the very beginning, there'll be some initial conditions, And at the very end, there'll be some terminal conditions. But in the middle, all those equations, that the structure of the Jacobian will be exactly the same. And so you can actually solve it either as a backward problem or a forward problem. Okay.
Now, Jacobian is a matrix of derivatives.
The
Is that how
Jacobian
you-
is the matrix derivatives of the nonlinear difference equations that are all stacked up.
Well, but so that's a linearization.
No, it's the numerical calculation of it at any point in time will be a linearized. So you get a linearized solution, but then you'll use that to find another solution that solves the nonlinear equations exactly.
You're going to iterate on the Jacobian. Okay, well, I need to learn about this.
So you can just take analytical derivatives of the difference equations and you solve them for specific values of the variables. And then
Well, that's what I am doing with the, that's what I meant.
no, but the difference is what you're doing is you're taking the nonlinear system, okay, and you're linearizing it. You're linearizing it, and then you're studying what happens if it ends up being a situation where you go into, you're at the capacity constraint, okay, but you're linearizing around that point, right? And that's what I understood what you're doing, or you actually calculate.
Yeah, there's a conjecture that you're either capacity constrained or not.
So this is totally general. So you could start off in the economy being at a capacity constraint, and it possibly through dynamics could go to the other side. Okay.
Okay. Well, let me look into that. Thank you very much for.
But it's standard. It's just in Dynair right now. You can basically just write out the difference equations, and it will solve it. Now it's not using the local perturbation methods in Dynair. Okay, that's different. Okay, like when you're doing estimation or solving a linearized representation of the model. But all the original Dynair stuff was all about that kind of problem. It just, because we went to estimation, Bayesian estimation in particular, and we got into this local approximation thing.
Okay, well, let me study their manual to learn about what you're talking about.
Okay, so good. Well, thank you very much for sticking around. Armin, thanks for all the great questions, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, James, for a wonderful presentation. I think it stimulated a lot of thought. Yes, go ahead, Christian. Go ahead.
No, I just kind of like, instead of, it was just kind of like applauding.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so
Nice to see
much.
you.
Thank you,
I learned
Oscar.
a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.